Alrighty. Prima facie duties that we have to follow based on particular circumstances are preferable to absolute duties. Two reasons. First, monistic moral theories fail means we should reject absolute duties in favor of prima facie duties. It's all year 6. Monistic theories were literally rejected when we reason about a situation. We generally take more into account than just whether it produces pleasing consequences or an absolute duty to keep our promises. There's also a way to keep both of these ideas in mind. The way to find all relevant considerations is by looking at relationships we have with people, because varying relationships we have with people as well as varying situations we can be confronted with. All that we can truly rely on our intuitions, theories, resting on absolute duties, build and respect relationships. People are not just in a beneficiary relationship, but also those of parent, friend, employee, etc. Duties we have with these people are not absolute because they are not only relevant to change their stringency. Ross's answer is prima facie duties. In most situations, we tend to have the duty to keep our promises, unless the duty tells us otherwise. And second, reflective equilibrium. Reflective equilibrium is a beneficial approach to moral questions. 2 words. Daniel 79. Backward duties, theory, the rest, general social theory, world morality, society, level 3 theories, principles, chosen level 2. Must match consider moral judgments and reflective equilibrium, yield peaceful, stable, full order society. Why the equilibrium can benefit morally free first philosophers? That's just apparently moral disagreements present. Non-moral disagreements. Why the equilibrium may reveal more systematic structure and sources of agreement. Philosophers and helpless unsure factors to constraint considerations. People choose relevant and more reasoning likely suggestions with the features depend on underlying level 3 theories, level 2 principal selectors, and adequate moral psychology would have to incorporate why equilibrium in science, judgments about plausibility, various universal connected theories already found acceptable, and reflective equilibrium justifies only prima facie duties. It's all year 6. The procedure for uses is reflective equilibrium, and reflective equilibrium tuition is not just more principles to tuition is why, appealing to non-evaluated facts and violations of personal relationships and total count. Why we possess these principles rest in initial credence are reflectively endorse situations and principles and increase credence when they are subjected to reflective improvement. With this procedure in place, there is no need for the pluralist to have a first principle. Ross uses this process to cover prima facie duties, use reflection to look at the relationships we have with other people, and then reflective equilibrium to which duties because this relationship is the most fundamental, and this justifies principles and principles is pluralistic and requires weighing prima facie duties of respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and the date. In that case, morally right next to the action that we selected by one with appropriately balanced respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, justice. Bush and Chapman say Ross's distinction between prima facie and actual obligation forms our analysis. A prima facie obligation is binding less than a more obligation always in a particular circumstance, actions of several qualities. Whether an action really is right is determined by the entire nation of the action, not just one characteristic. Given that notion of central Ross's theory of right action principles was likewise the theory of right action, and I contend that presumed consent for organ determined movement of cease respects our prima facie duties under principles 5 and an object system and normal means associated with it. A beneficence, presumed consent is key to beneficence, which turns utility contributes to an increase in organization while more 14. Regression analysis for donation rates 22 countries over 10 years reported the countries operating presumed consent donation rates 25 to 30% higher after taking into account all expenditure. Religious legislative systems, a systematic review concluded that relative contribution to this change favored those changes in education infrastructure was not clear. However, the regression analysis would lead us to believe that at least some increase in donation rates would occur purely as a result of presumed consent making compatible with the essence is at the heart of util increasing supply of organs transplants. They were also supported by util, and opt-out means more people will consent. Appears proof they learn subsidy. An online survey asked people whether they would be donors in the explicit consent condition. Participants were told the default was not to be donor in the PC version. The default was to be the donor in the default matter a lot. But participants had to opt in only 42% typically when they had to opt out. 82% agreed. Johnson and Goldstein analyzed such laws by comparing countries with presumed consent to explicit consent. And Germany, which uses option, only 12% gave consent, whereas in Austria 99% did. And Belgium and Austria approved on the board. After Belgium passed presumed consent donation rates rose dramatically, frequently cited examples to somewhat transplant centers. In Belgium, Leuven and Antwerp, Leuven switched presumed consent and its donation rate climbed from 15 to 40 donors per million. While Antwerp did not change its policy, really maintained previous levels. Austria raised donation. Quadruple and conscription can't stop it. Backlash and circumvention trial of its forward. If organ harvesting violates you held moral religious convictions, government attempts to use force to prevent organ destruction will encounter substantial resistance for those who wish to keep the bodies intact and adopt death and strategies that toward the initiative made direct removal of their bodies to friendly jurisdictions, be autonomy versus respect for wishes, presumed consent, with respect to wishes of most people, World War 14. If individuals do not register under the current system, their wishes may not be fulfilled. 70% of the UK population are not in the organ donor registers. Based on reports, 90% support organ donation, up to 30% of individuals who wish to donate do not have the wishes granted. There's potential for the 10% against donation not have the wishes met, and their families may only consent to donation, presumed consent to wishes of 10% of most, and this is an intuitive approach to autonomy for the medical profession. Deal 4. Consider the following scenario: you are in a community in which 5% oppose all medical treatment, 30% are Christian Science. One day, a 30-year-old is brought here, whereas to release unconscious without an immediate surgery. Each have been recommended to saying that the 30% chance the person's not will be operating on makes operating wrong. I doubt this conclusion tracks our moral intuitions. There's a 70% chance that we will treat the person the way you want, and most make it morally acceptable, not required to have a great chance of success. Through mistake claims, that's the concept of reason for presumed consent, and the non-interference model of autonomy fails the brain death agency. Deal 4. The living person we have 2 options to do something in the person's body or refrain when we refrain, but we do nothing to prevent her own decisions. We do not violate autonomy. We do not have the same option with the person who is brain dead. The refrain will not allow the person to determine for herself. The best we can do is treat her the way she most likely wanted. And what we're unsure about a patient's wishes, the idea that mistaken removal of organs is worse than mistaken non-removal is false. D and R is approved. Deal 4. Consider that a non-negligible portion of elderly terminal patients prefer not to be resuscitated. So what do EMTs do when they encounter unconscious patients in the EMT street? The patient even though the chance person prefer not occur practicing the body and the idea is morally worse. Not support based procedure current practice on a course of each consent we are justified with chance virtually non-existent and justified to respect wishes model and presumed consent 14. Under the respect wishes model, but mistaken removal and non-removal are equal and significance falls both ethical consensus from organization goes against the wishes of the fewest number of people, wishes of the system of presumed consent. Second, informed consent, mandated choice, violence, informed consent, guilt for. There's a significant moral difference between informed consent, mere consent, and self-determination is not protected. Two groups has informed information is not manufactured consent, morally taken from the mandated choice. Someone would be forced to answer the question on the tax force lacking info, make truly informed decision, and family veto solves guilt for. Poll numbers not down would give us a reason to presume they are guaranteed presumed consent must include a mechanism that can override the presumption the mechanism should be discussed with the family. We should inform the family as best we can, we fully respect autonomy, not really acting the court of person statements willing with informed positions, the organ policy, the best and subject autonomy is presumed consent of the family veto, and family veto is normal means, Rose and 11. We obtained data from 49 states, 5 nations, board of vacancy, sorted nation markets by the WHO, additional 5 nations, 5, and also 5 nations with presumed consent next to our form 21, 25, presumed consent nationwide, next to object red potential donation. See, non-adolescents, the principle of non-adolescents just as presumed consent will over to. Non-adolescents should be life potential donors around the time having someone after they get, they may utilize either organs, which potentially be life-saving. Does men's harm to thousands who need to die from lack of organ transplant, copy organ transplant. D, justice, presumed consent is key to justice, ensures equal opportunities for patients. Need of organs, well born for T. Shortage of donors means not all patients who require transplant have equal opportunities to donor organ. Any measure likely increases live organs, therefore congruent with justice, which requires equal opportunities for all. However, it must be sure that all who object to organ donation have the opportunity to register their wishes under presumed consent. Cross-legs. Oh.
You okay?
Good.
Okay. Let's talk about what normal means is.
Sure.
You first say that it is family consent.
Yeah, the Rosenblum et al. 11 evidence says family veto is normal means. In 21 of the 25 presumed consent nations, they allow the next of kin to object.
Okay. Will you defend the United States?
Yeah.
And only the United States?
Sure.
Sounds good. So also, what does immediate means? What does that mean in terms of time frame? When do you do the AF?
What do you mean?
Will you fiat that the AF happens now?
My AF would happen immediately.
Cool. So also, you implement it through policy action, right?
Yeah, I defend an implementation of an on-balance interpretation of the resolution.
Okay.
Well, actually, no, U.S. spec now. Sorry, because you said U.S.
Okay, that's fine.
My usual answer is on balance. I kind of went on autopilot because I'm a little sick.
Okay, that's fine. So let's talk about the autonomy arguments. So autonomy constitutes that we respect the wishes of the individual, right?
Yeah, that's the guilt for evidence.
Okay, so do you fiat that if someone says they don't want their organs taken, that doctors assent to that, or simply that you have a system that is implemented that
Well,
people...
no, it's that someone dies and we aren't really sure whether they would have wished to donate their organs had they not explicitly opted out, and we have pretty good odds that they would have wanted to donate their organs, given that polls prove that most people do think organ donation is good. So we should accept the probability that the dead cadaver would have most likely wanted to donate their organs.
Yeah, my question is a little bit distinct from that. My question is, do you fiat that a system exists, or do you fiat the automatic removal of their organs?
I don't fiat automatic removal.
It's just a system of opt-out organ donation, right?
Yeah, I defend opt-out plus family veto.
Okay, let's talk about your solvency evidence. That's your Thaler and Sunstein.
Yeah, that's one of the solvency cards. There are 3.
Let's talk about that. What does it take an evaluation of?
It's an online survey that asks people whether they would be donors. There were actually 3 separate conditions.
Where do they ask people from?
It asks people from the United States. That's the
only the United States?
Well, yeah, you wanted me to spec the U.S.
No,
I'm convenient because this evidence is about the U.S.
Okay, perfect. And it asks them simply if they want to donate, right?
There were 3 conditions. There was an explicit consent version.
No, I'm curious about what the question is. What is the question that they were asked?
Okay, so there was an explicit consent condition, and participants were told that they had moved to a new state where the default was not to be a donor, and then they were asked, do you want to be a donor? Then there was a presumed consent version, where people were told, you are in a state where the default is to be a donor. Do you want to be a donor? And then there was a third study where it was a neutral condition, where they were simply asked, do you want to be a donor? No mention of the default. In the presumed consent version, the vast majority of people did say, yeah, I'll donate my organs.
Okay, and that's Thaler and Sunstein?
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty good card.
Perfect. And then your Belgium and Austria evidence, does that talk about implementation in the United States, or does it simply talk about how it's been empirically successful in other countries?
Gundel is an article actually about the United States because he does talk about U.S. Congress.
Okay, perfect. That's convenient.
He does like an interview with like congressional interns that work with health policy.
Okay.
Maybe not in that article, but in another one. But he's from Stanford. He went to Harvard Medical School.
Sorry, crap. 320 left. The order is 1 off AC. Let me save it on a different document. Actually, yeah. I don't want to flash in my block, sorry.
It's all good.
Okay, I'll call it semis. This is semis?
Yeah.
1 at C.
Thank you.
Can I use your stand?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Is everyone ready?
Yep.
A, Counterplan text, the United States should build a social support for presumed consent through public education efforts and then implement presumed consent through sufficient social support and understanding presumed consent exists. The funding will be provided by the Division of Transplantation and Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, that's IOM 06. It would be premature to attempt to enact presumed consent policies at this time. The first step is to build a sufficient social support before introducing presumed consent through intensified public education regarding organ donation, and the state should not replace explicit consent with presumed consent. However, all parties should create over the social and cultural conditions that would be essential for the adoption of effective system of presumed consent. B is the competition 1 functional. The app advocates for the immediate passage of a plan that's verified by his answer and cross-examination. Don't let him sever out of that. Whereas the CP only advocates for a presumed consent after a certain initiatives have been implemented and conditions have been met. And 2, net benefits is key that public education initiatives are enacted before presumed consent is implemented in order to create a public support prior to implementation. And C, solvency. Empirically, public education efforts have been key to the success of health initiative. That's IOM to actively engage in general public to focus on public education issues. A challenge public education has been an important tool to such public health success as the motor vehicle safety and childhood vaccinations. A review of 10 greatest public school health achievements in the 20th century found that mass media school-based interventions and community-wide campaigns played a substantive role in positive change. A similar case can be made for raising awareness in the increasing positive societal response to organ donation, dispelling myths, increasing the dissemination of information, encouraging democracy, improving the environment for change will all work together to foster a more positive societal and individual response to organ donation. D, net benefits 1, misinformation. A, misinformation about organ donation is high. Now people are likely to opt out under a system of presumed consent due to misinformation when confronted with a decision. Absent information, people are more likely to opt out and not donate organs. As DLC 13, the significant variance between people who register to be donors and people who actually donate suggests that people are applying for a driver's license, and significant majority yet feel underinformed, yet when confronting decisions, individuals are receptive to donate under presumed consent. The opt-out provision would capture the people's premature underinformed decision not to donate, and when individuals in the media process of focusing on getting a driver's license, 52% incorrectly believe that doctors may not try to save their lives if they know they would wish to be organ donors. 61% mistakenly believe it may be possible for the brain dead to recover from injuries when the serious misconceptions of presumed consent decision made early without access to accurate information would lead to millions of ill-informed decisions. And surveys prove that many people would opt out under presumed consent, so fewer organs will be available than under status quo opt-in policy. And public education programs would solve for misinformation and promote donation. IOM 03, the 2005 National Survey of Organ Donation suggests that 30% would opt out under a presumed consent, and fewer transplantable organs would be available under presumed consent policy under a current opt-in policy of express consent, and that presently family members would give consent to organ donation. However, if presumed consent 30% of register as non-donors, 1/3 of the potential donors would block family from donation. People do not want to be on record as organ donors because they feel that they would receive inadequate care or their death would be hastened, and presumed consent would not alter such attitudes. It could exacerbate them. Several proposals indicate vigorous and extensive education programs to promote public understanding of values of education. And B, the counterplan solves for misinformation and stigma towards organ donation. Public education through HSRA would dispel myths that prevent people from donating organs, but status quo funding is insufficient. That's IOM 4 for public education. The message that should be highly visible, presented in a clear and easy to understand format, accessible to individuals for various educational levels. Information will be addressed for these specific issues of concern. Dispel myths regarding organ donation. Improving public education will require the efforts of the HRSA and the locus of the government funding in the area, which had a variety of public education and other approaches being explored, and limited funding place constraints on the potential to explore additional approaches. And HSR grants provide the public education about organ donation through social, behavioral, and media programs. That's IOM 5. The HRSA grants examine the interventions to increase organ donation rates. The emphasis on social and behavioral interventions which raise public awareness of social organization and generate public commitment, and the decrease in funding has placed severe constraints on the grant program. HRSA's research program focuses on the social and behavioral interventions of schools, workplaces, and community locations, and HRSA designates grants to media-based organization projects, and recipients include donor networks, foundations, and medical centers. The grantees use funds to raise awareness and encourage organizations through radio, television, and print advertisement, and public events. HRSA public education projects aim to increase the registry enrollment rates, as well as improve the public education towards donation to more broadly, and public education interventions are costly. However, potential is limited to the absence of an ongoing public education campaign. 2. Backlash. U.S. values specifically prevent the immediate implementation of presumed consent and will cause backlash, undermining act solvency. IOM 60. Several differences exist between U.S. values, particularly individualism, and values of countries with opt-out. Without wider consent in the United States about presumed consent, as implementation would lead to a decline in transplantable organs because of a considerable number of people with opt-out. It would be wiser to leave the current law in place while undertaking educational activities to promote donation that would be necessary to lay the foundation for transition to presumed consent policy. And backlash is empirically proven Americans' values of autonomy and privacy create a huge political barriers to implementing presumed consent legislation. The AF faces widespread political opposition, empirically proven by liberal states that have tried to implement presumed consent. That's Rodriguez. 12. Americans put paramount importance on the freedom of choice, evidenced by numerous Supreme Court opinions, and Americans expect that without their affirmative consent, privacy cannot be invaded by the government. The current opt-in organization system is acceptable because it's consistent with these principles. To most Americans, a presumed consent system flies directly in the face of these values, and the presumed consent government intrusion to the personal decision of organizations to default. Such intrusion would undoubtedly be met with much opposition, as already demonstrated by California and New York attempts to establish the state presumed consent systems, and the few states that have tried to implement presumed consent have failed, indicating any other states would cause even greater backlash, and the immediate implementation of presumed consent would fail due to the backlash of public and medical professionals. The CP is a prerequisite to first build social support for presumed consent before implementing it. That's IOM 7. Their data that presumed consent could be adopted effectively, implemented for foreseeable future. The attitudes of the medical professionals involved in organ recovery are important to implementing presumed consent laws. Opinions of the Council of Ethical Affairs on the AMA provide the clues that the Council has adopted the statement. A system of presumed consent raises serious ethical concerns. Opinion surveys also do not indicate the public support for opt-out policy. Surveys indicate substantial opposition to a policy of presumed consent will fail without the support of the public and relevant healthcare professionals. It seems likely that the imposition of presumed consent law without building first sufficient social support could generate adverse response to organ procurement efforts. Now onto the app. First off, the Taylor and Sunstein evidence first. You should prefer my evidence because there's only a net benefit that we could increase the absolute amount of people that would donate under. And second, his is not representative of the family, and the family are also one of the root causes of why people would not donate, but he only talks about the individuals. And third, his evidence is not properly representative because people are simply taking an online poll. It's not that they would be faced with the fears that the evidence that my evidence talks about. And fourth, you prefer my evidence because it's comparative between a world with education and without education. His is only comparative between a world of informed consent and explicit consent. And go on to the autonomy arguments first. The counterplan controls the interlink because people need to have the necessary information to express their autonomy. They need to have a legitimate expression of their will, but if they don't have the necessary information, that's impossible. And second, the doctors don't actually take organs because of the backlash against the system. That's the evidence coming off of the 1&C, which means that we can't respect the wishes of individuals unless we look through the 1&C. And off the family veto, I control the internal link to it because the family veto should be an informed decision that respects the values of the individual, and also the family veto should be consistent towards organ procurement in order to have a net benefit towards the idea of more donation. And also, you prefer my polls because empirics prove that public opinion surveys are inaccurate. In reality, people don't want to donate organs. That's Dan Harto 11. It is unclear whether such polls actually really show whether there's support to take the Netherlands, where the polling results are the same high level at the introduction of a donor register. All Justin reacts to declare whether they want to be a donor. Only 22% of the population have registered to be donors. And opinion surveys, 40% actually interviews say that their register as donor may be taking homage to the socially desirable, market desirable. This is a new card. Do you want me to flash that to you?
Yeah. Actually, you can do it after the speech.
Okay.
So speaking of that polls evidence, it's about the Netherlands, but we agree in cross-ex I'm defending the U.S., so why is this relevant?
I think the warrant still applies. It talks about how when you look at a population...
Wait, so a poll about people in a country that I do not defend logically somehow applies to the preferences of Americans?
No, look, there's a distinction. My argument is not that the polls of Netherlands indicate how the people in the United States want to consent. The argument is that the poll in Netherlands indicates that there's a discrepancy in the information that people tell that people disclose online versus what they actually do. So that warrant would still apply.
So your IOM evidence says that...
There's a lot of IOM evidence. Which one?
I know, but I'm going to refer to specific parts of the cards, so you'll probably know what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Your IOM evidence does say that Americans strongly value a very restrictive notion of freedom of choice, under which presumed consent would be bad. How would the counterplan change those fundamental values of Americans? Because, like, very rigorous freedom of choice is like a very strong American value.
Okay. The IOM, there's a few responses to that. First, there's at least a risk of offense, and then second, the IOM 4 and 5 evidence actually is very good on it. It talks about how we would have specific education programs that target individuals, and the warrant is that the underlying cause of all of those arguments and those fears and those values are because of misinformation. So the education programs
says that the message should be presented in a highly visible, clear, and easy to understand format. But where does your evidence say that the counterplan will actually result in a highly visible, easy to understand format, etc.?
The IOM5 evidence talks about how you can have these public education programs that increase registry enrollment rates as well as improve public attitudes towards donation more broadly.
Speaking of IOM5, it says that there has been a substantial decrease in funding for HRSA and that HRSA is really cash-strapped. What does the counterplan do to solve that? Do you just fiat an increase in HRSA funding?
No, the text of the counterplan, wait, I'm sorry, what line are you referring to?
The IOM5 evidence says, this decrease in funding has placed severe restraints on the grants program, and it also says, public education interventions are costly, however, and potential is limited in the absence of it. Yeah.
Yes, right, so the counterplan would move away from the status quo paradigm and say that we should be increasing...
fiat an increase in funding?
Is that we should increase the HRSA and that we should have more education programs as a prerequisite to doing the 1AC. That is exactly what the counterplan is.
So what would the public education programs look like? What would people be educated about? Let's say I'm a prospective organ donor. Educate me right now about why presumed consent is good. Convince me. So I'm a very patriotic American. I strongly believe in freedom of choice and the Founding Fathers. Educate me about presumed consent.
First, I don't think this is a representative scenario of what the HRSA would look like. It talks about education programs in the context of schools, the workplace. This is a... you're asking me for like a 15-second...
Let's say I'm a member of a school. Educate me right now.
You're asking me as a high schooler to be a representative of the HRSA in like 15 seconds.
HRSA educate people?
Right, so it talks about how it dispel myths and it isolates what the myths are.
What myths would they dispel?
Right, so it talks about how there are myths that the government would cut off the funding or they would cut off your life before the individual actually dies in order to take their organs. It would talk about those types of programs in order to move away from the paradigm of fear and the myths that exist in the status quo. That is not a process that I can do with you in 15 seconds of cross-ex as a high schooler.
By the way, I'm not really like a hardcore Founding Fathers kind of guy. That was hypothetical.
Thank you for the clarification.
I used to be in 8th grade. I was like a hardcore Tea Partier.
We've all seen the video. You timing this?
Yeah. So you said to be in schools?
And in the workplace, yeah.
Okay. Oh, can I see the Netherlands app actually?
Oh, yeah, sure. Cool. I'll put it on the flash. Do you need me to pause prep or?
Yeah, I'm good.
I'll just save as is with you. Okay, I'm going to save it as Netherlands on my flash drive.
Okay, 127. I will flash you one error. Still one error. So the order is new off, counterplan, AC. Everybody ready?
Pen and paper. I got it. New off, counterplan AC.
Oh yeah, the wording on the theory argument is going to be a little different.
Okay, new off, counterplan AC.
Yep.
Okay.
Everyone good? Alright.
Delay counterplans are a voting issue. A, they kill class. She just goes for a 6-minute counterplan and never has to truly engage the app. Class comes first is the only form of education you need to debate. And education is a voter system. The end goal of debate. Substance doesn't matter unless there's an educational benefit to discussing it. B, kills fairness because he moves the whole 1AC with feet on. It's a voter. 1 hour are disputed. Also, it's a voter for deterrence because they lost will disincentivize them from running this unfair and uneducational practice on future tournaments down the counterplan. He says the counterplan works within the schooling system, but the education system is dominated by the banking concept of teaching, which relies on alienating abstract truths. This means that working within the education system is never going to really convince people because it's just going to alienate them for identity. Education is suffering from narration sickness. The teacher talks about realities that were static and predictable readings found on top completely alien to the existential experience of the student's capital power is known. The student memorizes or repeats these phrases over perceiving the true significance of the affirmation of the student. So the depositories and the teachers, the depositor, this is the banking concept of education, which actually allows the students extensively as far as receiving and storing deposits people themselves are following the lecture transformation. Banking education maintains an impulsive society. The teacher talks and the students listen meekly. The teacher chooses the program content. The students adapt banking education regards people's mental beings. The more students work at storing deposits and trusting them, the less they develop critical consciousness. They tend simply to adapt to the world. So this the or the capacity to adapt the world. They can be dominated. And this is going to also be cross-applied to the workplace, whereas people in the workplace are going to try to be so dedicated to make ends meet that they aren't going to care about some pamphlet that says the presumed consent is a good idea. They're going to be more focused on their job too. The counterplan does not explicitly clarify what people are actually going to be taught. C. Crossix, that was an important question. I asked him what the HRSA would actually teach people about presumed consent, which means that we don't even know if the counterplan will actually dispel myths. It's too vague to actually be considered as a legitimate policy option. For example, the HRSM might not teach people about the respect for wishes model, in which case the people that are really radical about freedom of choice are just not going to listen to the question of autonomy. 3, there are some people that are hard asses or are really stupid, and education is never going to solve for them, which means you should prefer presumed consent if it's the case that more people are going to donate, because even if people are uninformed, because he's in a double bind. Either A, maximizing organ procurement is the most important priority, which means that it doesn't matter if people are uninformed, if they're still not opting out of the system. You might have dumb people that are just ambivalent, and even if we aren't informing them, it's good that they are proactively opting out. Or B, informed consent is a side constraint to maximizing organ procurement, in which case presumed consent is net beneficial to the counterplan, because normal means for presumed consent is a family veto, and the Guilford Evans says that family veto solves informed consent, which means there's no net benefit to the counterplan, because even if the counterplan is good for informed consent, affirming is simply sufficient because of the Guilford Evidence. But also, his own IOM 5 evidence says that the HRSA is really strapped for funding the status quo. Even if he says that he increases funding, he never clarifies how much funding would be increased in order to solve, which means that the counterplan is insufficient to solve. Also, people are never going to be convinced of really radical freedom of choice. People are never going to be convinced, which means that he's insufficient to solve. Let's see. Also, go to the AC. He's conceded that presumed consent increases organ donation. European countries prove it is a study over 10 years of 22 countries. That's well more than 14. Even if this isn't about the U.S. C. Crossix, he said his own Netherlands poll would still apply to the U.S. even if it's about Europe. I have more European countries in my study, which means you prefer it to the Netherlands poll. You'll have a lot of people in presumed consent that are not going to be opting out, which means that there's no need for education because the vast majority of people are still going to be participating in the system and giving up their organs, so there's no need to educate the vast majority of people. Also, under the respect for wishes model of autonomy, it doesn't matter if there's going to be a small minority of people who are going to outright object presumed consent. We don't need to get 100% of people on the side of presumed consent. As long as there is a majority of people that are supporting presumed consent, that's still good under the fewer mistakes model. And he's conceded with Guilford Evans that you prefer the respect for wishes model of autonomy over the non-interference model of autonomy, which means that presumed consent is a good idea. He's also conceded with Guilford Evans that family veto solves informed consent, because even if individuals would be uninformed, it's good that the families are making that decision, which means education is not key, because we should just leave it up to the families to make informed decisions, given that families are the most educated about their children, which means that there's no need for the counterplan for education, because families would be sufficient. This also avoids the Freire just had, because families don't fall into the same banking model because they have a much stronger and more personal, less alienating connection with their children. He says that he says that the counterplan is key to informed consent, but family veto is sufficient to solve, which means there's no necessity of doing the counterplan. He needs to win that it's necessary to do the counterplan over the app. Otherwise, you can just do the app. It's a sufficiency test.
the order is on his theory arguments very quickly, then counterplan AC.
Okay. Are you reading anything new? Oh, do you want me to say?
Yeah, there's no new. There's one new card actually. Do you want that flash?
Yeah.
I have my flash drive already in.
Okay, weird.
I'll save it as 2NR Tomasi, or Tomasi 2NR.
Thank you. What's it called?
Tomasi 2NR.
Awesome. Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, ready? Theory, counterplan, AC. Okay. Theory is really blipping in the one ear. Don't let it make a huge expansion in the next speech, but counterinterpretation is that the next may advocate for an alternative to presumed consent with the purpose of creating conditions necessary for presumed consent if there is a solvency advocate in the topic literature. And the standards is first, offense, 1, critical thinking, 8, my argument is key to real-world decision-making. Every policymaker, the person has to decide when to execute an action and what conditions are needed for the action to succeed. That outweighs his clash claim because we would have clash on a specific part of the advocacy and B, a delay. Counterplan is unique argument that people don't usually engage in this. Increases critical thinking because it's an uncommon strategy to make the app but a narrow issue surrounding the plan that also outweighs his clash argument because the clash that we have under the 1AC is the same every single debate. So you prefer this type of clash in 2 prep time. The F has infinite prep time for the advocacy, so the neg needs coordinate for unpredictable apps. Otherwise, the neg has infinite research for delay counterplans. Check back the skew that created by applying to my F and 3 ground. A real policymakers decide when to enact a policy. So the policy is coordinate ground since it contest a fundamental question of temporality that's necessary for any policy solvency advocate mechanisms. Proof that whether the U.S. is ready for presumed consent right now is the implementation concern. They kill education 90% of the policy making is implementation rather than analysis. That's Elmore. The decisions are not self-executing analysis of policy matters. Very little of the mechanism of implementing is poorly understood. 90% of the work achieving desired action is done with the realm of implementation. That turns the clash argument because it contextualizes what kind of clash we need, and it also turns the education arguments because it says that the defense of the 1AC should be one of implementation, and B, the advocate's plan text and clarification. The neg is competitive counterplans, ad hoc restrictions to the neg advocacy are unfair because they kill predictable ground for the neg. Also, off the fairness argument. Second, first, the entirety of my 1AC is a speech, which means that it does not move the 1AC. He just has to prove that the counterplan is a bad idea. And second, is a part of the 1AC. He should be ready to justify it, and I justify why this is a core ground. And third, I have a solvency advocate, which means it's something that you should predict for. Now go on to the counterplan. First, extend the counterplan that we should have social support for presumed consent for education before we implement presumed consent. That's the IOMO 6 evidence. Now, the first argument that he makes is the free error argument, but first is a terrible piece of offense in a wrong type of scenario. He talks about a social context of domination and a type of education, but there's no terminal impact to the debate in this. And the second, there is only a risk of offense of increasing the amount of consent because the framing issue is not one of domination. The framing issue is one of increasing the amount of consent that individuals give you. And three, it is not unique because we engage in this type of banking education, the status quo. There's no reason that one additional policy of education is going to make any sort of difference. He has no uniqueness on this claim. And four, this does not matter because the only framing issue in this debate is the solvency debate or the idea of autonomy. He's not doing the implication of the one error. Don't let him do in the two error. Now, the next argument that he makes is that there's no clarification what is actually taught. But the IOM evidence is very specific on this. The IOM and the DLC arguments talk about how there are misconceptions, there are myths that exist in the status quo. So we need to repel those myths and move away from those paradigms. They give specific examples of those myths, such as doctors would take their organs and take people off life support before they would even die. So the education programs will be moving towards this sort of paradigm, moving away from this paradigm and saying that people should be donating despite all of that. So the evidence is very good on that. And second, even if it doesn't give a clarification of that, there's still a net benefit, there's still a risk of offense that the education is a good thing. There are no arguments why the education would actually be bad. Now, the third argument that he makes is that they're stupid people, but the problem is he's missing the framing issue, which is that my evidence indicates that the stupid people, that if someone is stupid, that results in them deciding to opt out, because the type of stupidity is that they think that organ donation is bad. That is the framing issue on that. So that takes up the 8 point that we would want to maximize donation because you would want to inform inform people so that they think that organ donation is a good idea. Now, the viewpoint that he says that informed consent is normal means with family veto, but the problem is he's conceding the analysis from D1 and C that family veto is harmful because the family is also lack of information. It's not simply a question of young people versus adults. Adults as well need to have education within their workplace in order for them to know that organ donation is a good idea. So even if the individual consents, the family decides to not consent, which means that there is less beneficence, and it's also bad for his autonomy arguments because even if the individual wants to donate, the family goes against their wishes, which is bad for the respect for wishes model. And additionally, you can extend the DLC evidence that there's a minimum information that we need to have higher information, and people are likely to opt out because of it. There's a few pieces of weighing analysis, what you want to see that we'll do there, but the arguments, the surveys prove that public education is key to solvency and it's been empirically successful, such as things like vaccination programs. Now, the IOM4 evidence talks about how the counterplan is the solvency. It dispels those myths. The specificity of the myths is the solvency evidence. Now, the IOM5 evidence talks about public education about organs would increase the donation, which means that there's only a chance of net benefit to the advocacy. Now, the backlash argument goes completely conceded. You can extend the IOM6 evidence that we need to first prevent the implementation of the affirmative and then go through education programs so that people don't backlash against the policy. All of these statistics that he's reading to in the 1ARO talk about how people would donate, but that's not the only question. It's also a question of whether people would assent to this policy, whether they agree with the policy. That's the only thing that's spoken to with the one and that the negative speaking to about, which means that none of these solvency claims actually apply and none of the net benefits apply. Within a few months or years of the plan actually passing, it's going to get there's going to be a backlash, which means that there's only a risk of solvency with negating. So, and that's empirically proven. That's the Rodriguez 12 evidence. Now, he says that we're strapped for funding. We don't know how much we're going to increase, but first is that the text talks about how we're going to be increasing the amount of funding, that we would want to have more of these programs, and the second is there's no reason that the amount of funding is in question. It's simply that we would increase the funding until it is no longer an issue, and we have enough solvency that so that until it's no longer an issue, and we have these programs so that we can get them. There's no reason we would have, as long as the programs exist, that's fine. Now going to the app. Even if he's winning the arguments off of the app, he's conceding the rollback arguments, and which means that there's no way that he's winning off of the affirmative advocacy. But we'll go into the line by line. It's simply a comparison of the evidence. But the framing issue on all of this, it doesn't matter how well he says his evidence applies, because that doesn't matter. It's simply a question of there being a risk of offense from the negative, and that we increase the amount of donation that actually occurs. So he says that, the problem is that there's a few pieces of weighing analysis. The first is that the first is the net benefit argument that I explained, and the second is that his evidence is not actually representative. That's bolstered by the argument from about the Netherlands, that people, they say on the online surveys that they want to donate, but when they actually are faced with the decision, the lack of information means that they're not actually going to donate, which means that you should prefer the counterplan because it has the most amount of solvency. Now he says, and also you prefer because it's the only one that's comparative between the amount of education in the status quo with presumed consent and then presumed consent afterwards. None of his evidence is actually specific on that. None of his arguments actually apply. Now his family veto argument makes absolutely no sense because he's conceding that family veto is bad for the idea of individual consent and that the family is misinformed. So there's no solvency with the app, and it's bad for autonomy.
Okay, so the order is backlash, theory, and then Freire. Actually, no, backlash, Freire, theory. I think that's a cooler order. Alright, sounds good?
Okay, what was there again?
Backlash, Freire, theory.
Backlash.
So AC then the counterplan.
Backlash is on the counterplan.
No, but backlash, I'm going to answer backlash stuff in the AC. Like at the end of the 2NR, he was talking about that on the AC.
Okay.
So backlash, Freire theory.
Alright.
Everyone good?
Even if I conceded the backlash argument, he conceded my comparison with Wellboard 14 that clarifies how large the backlash would be. The Wellboard 14 evidence says that in a lot of European countries that had presumed consent, most people consented, and most people's organs were procured, and that there was a increase in organ donation that can be attributable to presumed consent, which means that the backlash would be a very small minority at best, which means that presumed consent would still be doing a major increase in organ supply. There's not going to be rollback, because the vast majority of people are still going to assent to presumed consent. He says only his evidence is comparative, but that doesn't matter because I'm doing the comparison to, which he's conceding. He says my evidence is not representative because of the Netherlands, but he's conceded the weighing argument I've done that my evidence takes into account 22 countries over 10 years, whereas he's only looking at one country at best. Which means that, he also conceded the framing issue of the sufficiency test, that as long as the affirmative is sufficient to majorly increase organ donation, that there's no net benefit to doing the counterplan. His risk of offense argument is very weak, and the way we're presumed consent is a very sufficient policy argument to go for. He conceded that framing issue. Now Freire. He says I don't have an impact on Ferrari, but I did. The alienation argument was a solvency deficit of the counterplan, that people are alienated by the banking model of education and the status quo. That means that the counterplan is not actually going to change people's real lives, because they're just going to be alienated by the banking model. He also makes an argument about the working class, but he's conceded by analysis about the workplace as well. That people in the workplace are going to be so determined to try to make ends meet that they aren't going to bother with a pamphlet that says that presumed consent is a good idea. The first half of the evidence is really good, and it says that the education system is dominating the status quo. The banking constitution, whereas teachers just transmit facts that are abstract and alienating, and then that students are not going to care about in the status quo. If you just read a list of facts about organ donation to a student in the status quo, most of them are probably going to be bored and are not going to care, which means that there isn't actually going to be any tangible impact on education. That's also going to apply for adults as well, given that they were also a product of the status quo model education. He says that this applies to the status quo, but even if this education system exists in the status quo, the plan does not go through that education system. Only the counterplan does, which means that I do control uniqueness as well, because he said that only the counterplan would go through the education system. Also, so that's the solvency deficit of the counterplan. So that's also a net benefit to the app, because presumed consent does increase organ supply. That's the well-worked routine evidence now theory. He's conceded that delayed counterplan skill fairness because he moved the entire 1AC with the end. He's also conceded drop the beta and doesn't go over an argument, which means that this is a no risk issue for me. He says that it doesn't. Also, fairness outweighs the education arguments because if debates are unfair, then people are just going to read theory instead of engaging with the educational substance. The app also fairness comes before education because we can get education out of round, whereas fairness is most constitutive of your role to judge, since you have to determine who the better debater is. He never did any weighing between fairness and education, so allow me to do so in the 2AR. Also, he says that he didn't move the AC. He said he didn't move the entirety of the 1AC because the lack of education is a part of my app, but he did move the entire 1AC through fiat, whereas he is agreeing that presumed consent is good and is then focusing on a really minor technical issue, whereas the entirety of my offense in the 1AC was comparative between presumed consent and a lack of presumed consent, not presumed consent, this delay counterplan. For example, all of the cards that I've read that compare respect for wishes with the non-interference model, that is comparative between presumed consent and the standard autonomy NC, which is the most predictable thing I've seen in this topic, which means that he definitely put in the entirety of the AC. Also, he said he had a solvency advocate, but that doesn't mean he said he had a solvency advocate, but he broke new. No way I'm going to predict some random delay counterplan. So vote half on fairness. Yeah.